Cuba as a socialist country that invests not for the sake of making profit for a small group of people, but for the sake of meeting the people's needs and making their lives better, they have a big chunk of their revenue invested in medicine and in education and in their national healthcare system. They've developed, vaccines and treatments for diabetes and cancer and HIV that are just tremendous and would save literally hundreds of thousands of lives a year in the US. And American people are dying because they don't have access to those treatments that have been developed in Cuba, and they don't have access to them thanks to the blockade. So it's not only affecting Cuba tremendously, but it's also affecting American citizens quite a bit. Specifically, in the case of medicine, the Cuba's Ministry for Public Health reports that Cuba has denied the right to acquire technologies, raw materials, reagents, diagnostic means, medicines, devices, equipment, and spare parts necessary for the best functioning of its national healthcare system, which must be obtained in geographically distant markets or through a third country with an increase in cost. Technologies from the U.S. or with more than 10% components from the U.S. cannot be acquired by the island, which has a negative impact on healthcare outcomes. In some cases, it is necessary to send patients abroad at a much higher cost than doing the procedure in national territory, even if the technology was available. For instance, from January to July 2021, the Medical Products Import and Export Company contacted 65 U.S. companies to inquire about the possibility of importing medicines, equipments, devices, and other supplies necessary for the care of the Cuban people through the national health system. Of these, 56 did not respond to the request by the Cuban entity, and 3 responded negatively, which were Owens and Minor Incorporated, Mercury Medical, and Eli Lilly. No surprises there. The Omeda, General Electric, and Hewlett Packard companies were asked for multi-purpose mechanical ventilators for newborns and infants, as well as for multi-purpose cardio monitors, which include blood pressure monitoring and other parameters. Its acquisition has yet to be made possible. They completely ignored the request. In the same way, the One Lambda company was asked for kits for HLA typing, and which are essential for determining the compatibility of a kidney transplant candidate with possible donors, and they could not be acquired either. There's around 158,000 patients that are harmed by the impossibility of assessing technology for the implantation of percutaneous valves, what are called TAVI valves. So I have a bunch of examples in the article if anyone wants to see them. I don't want to keep reading specific medical examples, but I go through like 2 pages worth of examples where technology, medicine, a variety of different things, Cuba just cannot get a hold of them because the places that produce them are blocked from selling them to Cuba by the influence of the U.S. And that's just in terms of healthcare. That's a study that I published earlier this year that was just looking at healthcare. It's the same in every other area of society, and it makes it extremely difficult to develop and provide what's necessary for its people. Even though it does that, it's still relatively poor. And socialism is not about poverty or making everyone equally poor. We want to increase the wealth of society so that everyone has more than enough in order to flourish as individuals embedded in community. And Cuba's not able to do that because of the blockade. And so that narrative that, the people that go to Cuba, they go to the poorest parts and they're like, oh, this is what socialism has done. That's complete bullshit. What socialism has done is ensure that with the little resources that they have, everyone is fed and no one's dying of hunger and no one's homeless.
It's heartbreaking because you have people who are like me who are on kidney dialysis that want to get a transplant in Cuba and they can't because of these sanctions and these blockades, which means that they can't even improve their quality of life. And that's what hurts because I'm trying to imagine myself, in Cuba trying to get on the transplant list. Like, look, I even had the application for the transplant list right here, right? And the thing is that, if I can't do it, then my quality of life, that I want to improve, it doesn't improve. Everybody knows that Cuba has great healthcare. The Michael Moore documentary called Sicko, there was a part where they actually take a boat to Cuba and get their medications and get healthcare done for free in Cuba. And if you're being ran by a tyrannical government, having free healthcare, this doesn't make sense to me, because if you have a tyrannical government, you're not going to have free healthcare. What country doesn't have free healthcare? Oh, the United States. Anyway, so one of the things that really tripped me out, I'm sorry, but I was tripping balls over this, was Operation Miracle. And a lot of people don't know about Operation Miracle. And I was like, what? When I found this out.
Yeah, so you have a situation in Venezuela where Hugo Chavez gets elected. I believe it's in '99, and they have tremendous difficulties because all of the components that I talked to you about Cuba, the looting of their resources and the super exploiting of their people by primarily American multinational monopoly corporations, but also by other capitalists from the Western world, from the global North. These are themes that reappear in Latin America in general and in the Caribbean. So these are similar issues to the ones that Venezuela was facing. The vast majority of their people were illiterate. They did not have medical care, the capacity for medical care, and the same was the case for Cuban people before the revolution. And you have with Operation Miracle in 2004 the sending of Cuban doctors to Venezuela. And I forget the number of how many people were cured, but if I want to say it was in the hundreds of thousands or the tens of thousands of people were cured from their blindness. And it was called Operation Miracle because it is miraculous when you go from not being able to see from one day to another. And this is not an isolated event that was done just because Venezuela was socialist and Cuba wanted to show solidarity with the socialist nation. Cuba has, as the country that produces the most doctors per capita, they've been sending doctors around the world from the beginning of the revolution. And
Mm-hmm.
that's very telling because as soon as the revolution happens, there is a tremendous exodus of professionals, medical professionals, and medical teachers. And in the University of Havana alone, if I recall the statistic correctly, I think only 12 teachers stayed in the University of Havana Medical School. 12 teachers out of around 200 were the only ones that stayed after the revolution. Because professionals see their interests threatened by this popular revolution. They're part of the class that lives somewhat luxuriously in the imperialized country, so they fled to the US. And in the midst of this exodus of professionals, Fidel makes a comment in 1960, right when the revolution happens. He says Cuba will be a country of professional men and women. Che repeats similar comments, and this is absurd. They just lost their professional workforce, but they invested. They changed the structure of healthcare and the Ministry of Public Health and Education. They nationalized it so that it serves the need of educating people and developing them. They made it easier for people to get an education. They developed programs so that healthcare doctors and nurses could be developed easier. And, they did all of this. And as soon, within the first few years of the revolution, Cuba's sending doctors all over the world.
Yeah.
And within a generation or two, it's got a tremendous surplus of doctors. And it's exporting, as the saying goes, it's exporting doctors, not bombs.
Yeah.
And as Helen Yaffe, who's one of the leading scholars on Cuba, she writes that there's tens, if not hundreds of millions of people around the world who can say that they owe not only their health but their lives to those efforts of Cuban doctors.
Yeah.
So it's just incredible. It's a national health system
Yeah.
that's tremendously planned at different levels. It's got short term, middle term, and long term plans. It's the approach to medicine, man. It's so different
It
from.
is. One of the things I want to say, and maybe you can coin this phrase. You can take it from me if you want. And it's like, for Cuba, instead of having boots on the ground, they have lab coats on the ground.
Mm,
You know, and so I think that's, it's like, instead of having people that are trained to take a life,
yeah.
they're sending people who are trained to give a life. And it's crazy. Because it's like, it just makes me imagine, what if the United States had the same type of policy, foreign policy, of instead of boots on the ground, we put lab coats on the ground.
We can't
Imagine.
have that, and that's the thing that people, we fight for like Medicare for all, and I think we should fight for all of that. But when you
Mm-hmm.
look at like the most profitable industries in the U.S.,
Yeah.
the medical pharmaceutical industrial complex, it's up there. It's up there amongst the most profitable, and
Yeah.
it's an industry that profits off of sickness.
Yeah.
And its role in American politics makes me think that in order to get even these moderate reforms that we would like, a
Mm-hmm.
more radical transformation uh, of the country has to take place, because those people are not going to go down and let you just nationalize your health system from one day to the next when they're some of the most powerful moneyed interest in the country. So
Mm-hmm.
Cuba's able to do that again because it's a socialist society. It produces for the sake of meeting people's needs. Its government and its civil institutions are all aimed at uplifting people and not serving the interest of the capitalists and the interest of profit and capital accumulation. And what's very sad, I love that phrase. Instead of boots on the grounds, we send lab coats on the ground. And what's very sad is that the U.S. has, in a very despicable and disrespectful manner, claimed that the doctors are slaves. That's been the narrative of the empire. These doctors are slaves of the Cuban government that are forced to do this in order for the Cuban government to, to gain goodwill from the international community and make money or something, which is, it's completely absurd because half of the missions are done for in the poorest corners of the earth are free, and the other half are done at a sliding scale. That means that they pay however much they're able to pay, and to call these people that are seen by the Cuban people as heroes, to call them slaves, and to degrade them in the way that the imperialist narrative does, is so extremely dehumanizing and disrespectful. But that's a common thread of the U.S.'s narrative, not just on Cuba, but on anyone who stands up to the interests of American imperialism. What we're seeing now with the narrative against Russia, it's such a despicable and dehumanizing narrative. And that's a constant thread. They do it against Venezuela. They do it against China. They do it against Nicaragua. Any country that stands up to the interest of monopoly capital, to the interest of U.S. imperialism, will be dehumanized as an essential component in manufacturing consent in the populace within the empire for these operations abroad.